Ciao everyone, I'm Abby Martin and this is Breaking the Set. So if you're like everyone else I know, you've probably spent the last couple days watching the entire second season of the best show ever, not on TV, House of Cards. Not only is the show brilliantly scripted, directed and acted, its entire premise is based on the dark underbelly of DC politics, the backhanded deals, the bribes, the cover-ups, and the political elite's complete contempt for us peons. But that's not all. It also displays how politicians use the corporate media to peddle their narratives. Clearly, the writers of the show have been paying attention to what's going on behind the scenes of American politics, far beyond than what's shown on the MSM. Spoiler alert, if you haven't watched season 2 yet, cover your ears. I was so happy to see a mention of internet activist Barrett Brown, the man facing a 100-year sentence for posting a link, as well as the plotline of a sting operation conducted in order to entrap an eager journalist into becoming a cyber terrorist. But alas, as exciting as it is to see the complete corruption and sleaze that defines deceit laid out in such a way, it's all fiction at the end of the day, right? Well, leading actor in the series, Kevin Spacey, who plays a Democrat but is eerily reminiscent of Dick Cheney, has done a media blitz to promote the show, in which he says political insiders have told him House of Cards isn't actually that different than DC. Spacey says that the plot lines aren't that crazy, and when asked about the national obsession with the show, coupled with Washington's growing unpopularity, Spacey said, quote, "Well, I've heard from lots of people, and some people feel 99% of the show is accurate, and the 1% that isn't is that you could never get an education bill passed that fast." Wow, I couldn't agree more. So let's sit back and wait until the whole House of Cards comes crashing down. Until then, let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air that's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Just when it seemed like the anti-government protests in Kiev had begun to die down, the last 2 days have seen the deadliest and most violent developments on the ground since opposition forces first occupied Independence Square 3 months ago. According to Ukraine's Interior Ministry, at least 26 people, including police and protesters, have been killed, and 240 people have been hospitalized from incoming projectiles, including Molotov cocktails and live ammunition. Protesters are demanding that President Viktor Yanukovych step down after his decision not to sign a trade deal with the European Union. But instead of letting a sovereign nation take care of its own affairs, Ukraine appears to be becoming a proxy battleground for both Western and Russian interests. In fact, just today, Obama spoke out against the violence in Ukraine, saying that the U.S. holds Ukraine's government, quote, primarily responsible for ensuring that they are handling protesters peacefully, and there will be consequences if people step over the line. Wow, big talk from a man who oversaw his own government's brutal crackdown on the Occupy Wall Street movement. So in order to get a more accurate picture of what's really happening in Ukraine, earlier I spoke with RT correspondent Alexei Yarochevsky, who's on the ground in Kiev. I started by asking him to give us a timeline of the events that has led to this brutal violence.
First of all, it seemed like a compromise was reached between the opposition and the protesters and the authorities here in Kiev when the authorities agreed to release all those detained in the 2 months of protests, and the opposition in return promised to vacate all the administrative buildings they have captured across the country. They have done so. Both of the sides have completed their part of the bargain. After which the opposition decided to hold a peaceful march, as they described it, towards the parliament. It was on the day, on Tuesday, when the parliament was supposed to elect a new prime minister for the country. At some point, the protesters reached the police cordon, and it's still unclear who started the pushing and shoving, the rioting, but more likely it were the protesters who attacked the police at first, and things got very bad. It's already almost 30 people killed, including 10 policemen. Things got very violent. It's nothing compared to what happened a little more than 3 weeks ago here in Kiev, when the first wave of rioting and violence hit the streets of Ukrainian capital and basically many cities across the country as well. So now it's pretty much at a standstill, but still it is very violent and it's very tense. No one knows where it's going to go.
And can you give us a rough estimate, rather, of how many people are still rioting in Independence Square? As you mentioned, at least 26 people have been killed, including 10 police officers and a journalist, according to Ukraine's Interior Ministry. Can you also outline the circumstances of both the protesters and police officers' death, as far as you know?
Well, it's really hard to estimate the exact numbers of how many people are actually involved in the protest, as well as it's hard to estimate how many people are involved on the side of the police. But this is definitely thousands, because the Independence Square pretty much filled with people all day long, and people keep coming in, especially in the late hours after workday finishes in Kiev. The numbers expand. These people are of different age groups and different social groups. The police line, I just went there a few hours ago, and I saw a very tense picture as well. There are hundreds of interior troops there, as well as riot policemen. Some of them are calm, believing that nothing is going to happen in the near future. It's still pretty much in the dialogue stage, but some of them are pretty tense. They are on edge, expecting things to get worse, to intensify. And indeed, it's not calming down. We can see flashbangs and Molotov cocktails thrown from both sides towards each other from time to time. It's not dying down, as we can see. In regards to the journalist who was killed last night, it was confirmed basically by the Interior Ministry. It was a journalist of a local newspaper. Reportedly, his car was attacked by a group of unidentified men. It's still unclear who those men were. Reportedly, they threw Molotov cocktails at the car and then shot live rounds at the car, killing the journalist with a gunshot wound into his chest. Obviously, many have been outraged by the fact that a journalist was killed in the line of duty here in Kiev, as well as we know that at least 28 journalists have been injured in the bloodletting events on Tuesday here in Kiev.
I can only imagine how tense it is, Alexei. You're very brave for being out there right now. I was just going to ask you, have the protests escalated in response to these murders? And why are we seeing so many images of large fires? I mean, what kind of tactics are both police and protesters using here?
Well, I couldn't say that the protest intensified because of the murders. We can say that on the 22nd of January, when the first protesters were slain in this uprising, that's when things got pretty much escalated. And what we're seeing over the past 2 days in Kiev is pretty much a continuation of what happened back then in January. It got calmer for a few weeks, but then it returned to this stage. And provided the fact that so many people have already died, it is creating additional tension. It is certainly raising the tension to a peak level here in Kiev. And talking about the fire, the wall of fire, which is right there beside where I'm standing right now, you can probably see it very clearly right now. It is a wall of burnt tires. This is kind of tactics which the protesters have been using ever since mid-January, when they first lit tires on fire. This is creating a huge cloud of black smoke. It's really hard to see anything through that smoke. I can tell you, I've just been there at the police line. The wind is blowing into that direction. I was standing there, I couldn't see anything, I couldn't breathe, because this is a very toxic smell. This is the kind of tactic they use to basically separate themselves from the police in the first place, and also to create something of a diversion for the police not to attack them. It is tense because they are not, they're still in a defiant mood, those protesters. They're not letting go of their ultimate goal to oust the president, and that's why they continue burning everything they see in their hands, tires, clothes, wooden planks, and everything they can find.
Alexei, given the fact that the Ukrainian government had passed that bill essentially banning protests or groups of people in the certain areas of protest, have there been any mass arrests that you've seen?
Well, we do know that the government's response so far has been pretty tough on the latest escalation of violence. We heard from the president that he wants to see some of the opposition leaders under trial for inciting this latest spin of violence. We also do know that the Ukrainian government has implemented something called a counter-terrorism operation mode in the country, especially after the information that from the security services in the country that the protesters raided one of the headquarters of the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, in the west of the country and managed to steal 15,000 bullets and 300 or 400 handguns, machine guns and different kinds of firearms. Reportedly, they're delivering them to Kiev, so this is creating a lot of tension. But as for arrests, in the past several days, we haven't seen many arrests. In fact, we haven't even had any reports coming from the side of the opposition that some of the people have been detained, unlike what was happening in January when the first wave of violence broke out in Kiev. That's when dozens and hundreds were arrested. Now it's not the case. It's pretty much shooting different projectiles at each other, even including live rounds coming from the opposition side. But no arrests have been made as far as I know.
Alexei, there are reports here, of course, there's a lot of different reports going on of accusing the government for having agents on the ground, inciting the violence, paying people on the ground, while the government's accusing, of course, right-wing factions of the opposition for leading the riots. Can you speak to either of those allegations?
Well, we keep hearing reports constantly that there's a certain group that the Ukrainians call Titushki. It's something like a provocateur group, which the government reportedly uses against the protesters. There are indeed, there have been some numerous reports of people wearing sports clothes in different cities of Ukraine, beating up the protesters. They're not dressed in police uniforms, so it is unclear who these people are representing. So this is creating something of a confusion here. On the side of the protesters, we have something of a segregation as well, because we have the peaceful protesters, the people who are essentially unhappy with their government, the policies, and they have been protesting for the last 2.5 months. And there's also the right-wing sector, the so-called right-wing sector. They're hardline nationalists. They're pretty much radicals, as many people have been describing them. They live by their own laws, judging by what their leader has been saying. They're not obeying any laws and any directives coming from the opposition politicians in Ukraine. They're pretty much on their own, and they are the ones in the core of the protest. They are the militarized wing. They are the spearhead of the protest. They are the ones creating all this havoc, causing unrest and throwing projectiles at the police.
Alexei, considering that we've seen U.S. Senator John McCain visit Ukraine a few months ago to voice his support for pro-EU protesters, is there any evidence that Western powers are logistically supporting the uprising?
Well, indeed they do. We keep seeing European politicians with their statements coming out, basically supporting the opposition movement, calling on sanctions against the government. Just recently, the head of the Euro Commission said that some of the Ukrainian politicians must be sanctioned for inciting this violence here. They put the blame directly on the government. Similar statements have been coming from the United States, with the Assistant State Secretary Victoria Nuland also speaking out against the government and calling for a stop of violence. Yes, I do remember John McCain speaking at the stage right behind me. He was standing at the Maidan, at the Independence Square, saying that Russia must not interfere into the domestic affairs of Ukraine. Well, many people I know here in Kiev were actually asking the same question to Mr. McCain, what he was doing here, whether his actions was in fact a direct involvement in Ukraine's internal affairs. So yes, indeed, we're seeing lots of influence coming from the European states, the United States, towards Ukraine, towards the situation, although there has been no direct involvement so far, even though we have seen hints coming from some of the top high-profile politicians in Europe that they may take some action, as I've said, maybe that's sanctions, maybe something else against Ukraine's authorities if unrest and violence continues here.
Unbelievable. It's time for state actors to stay out of it. Really chaotic. Thank you so much for being on the ground, reporting firsthand. Alexei Yaroshevsky, RT. Coming up next, I'll break down why North Carolinians are trying to take back their state.
emotions are force-fed.
Two explosions near the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
More than 1,000 people have gathered.
What is the latest that you're hearing about the number of victims?
Over the course of the last year, progressive social movement has taken root in North Carolina. The protests have been coined Moral Mondays, and they're made up of civil rights groups, unions, and average citizens who have witnessed a systematic takeover of the state by conservative lawmakers. The movement reached a groundswell last summer when polls showed that there was more support for protesters than the state's own lawmakers. And so far this year is drawing even more backing. The NAACP estimated that the first demonstration of 2014 in the city of Raleigh drew in as many as 100,000 protesters, making it the largest civil rights gathering in the South since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So what exactly is sparking so much outrage? Well, there isn't one single issue, but rather a myriad of policies that are negatively impacting hundreds of thousands of people across the state. Among the biggest concerns cited by North Carolinians is the elimination of Medicaid coverage for 500,000 people, racially driven voter ID laws, cuts to early voting access, the repeal of environmental protection laws, an amendment to the state constitution that bans same-sex marriage, and the list goes on. Most, if not all, of the disdain for these backward policies falls on this guy, North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory, who was elected in 2012 and personally signed off on most of these bills. Now, while McCrory has largely dismissed the Moral Monday demonstrations, it's hard to dismiss his connection to North Carolina's latest environmental disaster, a massive coal ash spill that dumped 82,000 tons of toxic sludge into the Dan River, making it the third largest coal spill in U.S. history. But Duke Energy, the company responsible for the spill, isn't being held accountable, and it might have something to do with the fact that Governor McCrory worked for Duke Energy for almost 30 years and remains a stockholder in the company, or the fact that over the course of two political campaigns, Duke Energy and its Political Action Committee donated at least $1.1 million to McCrory. All this cold, hard, cold cash is probably why on at least 3 occasions over the last year, the state has blocked attempts to sue Duke Energy. See, environmental groups tried to sue under the Federal Clean Water Act to force the company to clean up its leaky coal ash ponds. But on 3 separate instances, the state's Department of Environment and Natural Resources stepped in as plaintiffs themselves and blocked the lawsuits. It's worth noting that McCrory appointed the head of that agency, who's referred to Duke Energy as a partner and customer. But you know what? Duke did end up shelling out a hefty collective settlement, a whopping $99,000. You tell me if that's enough money to hold the biggest electric company in the country accountable. And check out this convenient coincidence regarding 3 Duke Energy gifts near the timing of the blocked lawsuits. The Charlotte Observer pointed out just today that a $4,000 contribution was given to the Pat McCrory committee only weeks after plans were announced to sue the company. Then, a contribution of $100,000 was given to Duke by the given by Duke to the Republican Governors Association less than a month after the second notice of the same lawsuit. And finally, Duke gave a generous donation of 175 G's to the Governors Association, which was delivered after environmental groups finally filed the lawsuit over Duke's power plant in Wilmington. Well, luckily, this despicable revolving door can no longer be hidden in the wake of one of the worst environmental disasters in the state's history. And now a federal investigation is being launched in McCrory and his dealings with Duke Energy. But given this government's penchant for corruption, I'd be willing to bet that Governor McCrory won't get more than a slap on the wrist for trying to drive the state into the ground. But if the growing support of the Moral Mondays movement is any indicator, I'd say that North Carolinians are poised to take back their state. Millions of Americans are dependent on credit cards, and that dependence has led to a nation being crushed by debt. According to Federal Reserve statistics, the average household owed more than $7,000 on their cards in 2013. But it might surprise you to learn that debt might not be the #1 concern when it comes to credit cards. What's even more worrisome is the rapidly rising rate of credit card theft. In fact, according to the latest numbers of the Bureau for Justice Statistics, about 7.7 million people had their credit cards numbers stolen in 2012, a 59% increase since 2008. And right now, the U.S. accounts for 47% of credit card fraud in the world, even though it processes just 24% of all payments. This disturbing trend is best exemplified by the breach of credit card information last December at Target stores across the nation, when as many as 110 million customers had their personal data hacked, including about 40 million credit and debit card numbers. So why is the U.S. unique when it comes to credit card vulnerability? We'll answer this and what we can do about it. I'm joined by RT correspondent Amira David. Thanks so much for coming on. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
So Amira, tell me about the kind of credit card fraud that most people are falling
So I'm sure you know
to.
this, but credit card fraud is a kind of identity theft, essentially. It's one form of it. And the majority of the kind of credit card we're seeing happen in the United States is very simple. It's kind of petty theft. So what happens is once your information gets compromised on a reader somewhere or it gets stolen somehow, a lot of times it'll end up on some kind of black market site, and these criminals come and they have these chat rooms where they will literally sell your information to any buyer. And you think it would sell for a lot of money? It doesn't sell for a lot of money. It sells for Target, it's sold from $20 to $200, and they go for as little as $1. So it's really, really scary. And what they'll do is they'll make a lot of small purchases. You may have seen this before, where you'll just have a random amount, DirecTV, a flower bouquet.
Something that you might not even notice.
Exactly. And it's a lot of times it'll be purchased in the state you live in. So your bank won't necessarily know because it's not flagged. So we're starting to see this a lot more now than we did in the past.
You know, Amir, you just covered this. You did a great piece on it, and you know what was most shocking to me is 47% happens in the U.S.
It's almost half.
I can't believe that. I mean, why is it happening here at such an alarming rate?
It's incredible. I mean, we are seeing this happen more now. I mean, Target, if that doesn't tell you everything in itself, I mean, 70 million plus people. They're saying it could go up to 110 million. You had Neiman Marcus, 1 million, and most recently, I don't know if you were affected by this, but Kickstarter, my Kickstarter was affected as well. So even in places, even in non-retail places. But I actually spoke to an online security expert about this, and he said it really has to do with the way American companies are sort of securing their data. So let's take a look at what he had to say.
One of the things we have to think about is what I call outside in, inside around. A lot of times companies are securing extremely well the outside in security. Don't let anybody in the front door. Then there's gaps in the inside around. Once you're in the front door, you can go to every room in that house.
So as he said, you know, a lot of companies are putting focus on making sure that no one breaches their company. That's the outside in. But in terms of the inside around, when someone gets in, they have free reign. They can go to any of the servers, and that's how so much information was lost.
This is a very scary thought, but thankfully people are talking about moving over to this new technology called EMV. What is that?
So one of the reasons why the United States is so vulnerable is because we're still using that magnetic strip. That's the strip on the back of the card. And Abby, it is so incredibly easy for hackers to exploit that information. So on the other hand, you've got EMV, that stands for Europay, MasterCard, and Visa. And it's a new technology that's being incorporated pretty much in every country besides the United States. It's in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And it basically is a small chip that's implanted into the card and employs cryptography. So it's got a lot of cool security features. One of those security features is that it asks you a series of questions that you set up and only you will know the answers to, that are literally, as the expert told me, only in your brain, that no one else could answer. And so you can't make a purchase before, sort of getting through that line of defense. So it does help.
Another line of cookies and questions and security questions.
In this case, it might actually be helpful. In this case, it might actually be helpful.
So are there any proposed measures in Congress to adopt this technology?
So one of the good things about this whole thing is that, it brought the CEOs of these companies to Congress to be asked questions. And when they came, they had a conversation about how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? How can we move toward this EMV technology? Why are we not there yet? And of course, there's no proposed legislation on this, as You know, Congress is, you know, they like to talk for a very long time before doing anything. But I think one of the sticking points is how much it's going to cost. Just to give you an idea, the cost of issuing 510 million new EMV plastic cards, installing millions of new EMV readers in retail stores and at ATMs, that's going to cost $8 billion. Now, that's not a lot of money for big corporations, right? I mean, they can afford to make that change. But for smaller companies, for mom and pop shops, for small grocery stores and that kind of thing, that's a lot of money. So, you know, it remains to be seen whether they sort of work out the financial floor plan.
Who knows when Congress is really going to tackle this? I mean, it's really left up to us, as you said. You know, there's a lot of things that we can do. And really, is EMV technology the only solution? Is there anything else that can possibly solve these problems?
Well, to be honest, Abby, it's scary. There really isn't. Even with EMV technology, you're not 100% protected. And so a lot of people are talking about, well, okay, even if we do move over to this new technology, you know, it's not going to help. It will help in some ways, but the reality is you have to take your own precautions. So that means you have to sort of, as one expert put it, own your own security. So that means, you know, changing your passwords on the various websites that you're using, your banking, even your Gmail, anywhere you would keep sensitive information, and also monitoring your credit card statements. I think people get annoyed by doing that, going through line by line, but do it. It helps a lot, and you can really save yourself from it progressing to identity theft.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, checking even these small purchases, really, sometimes they test you, and you know, they'll purchase something small in this state, as you said. Really, it's up to us, as annoying as it is, to go through the CAPTCHAs and security questions and go into your bank
this
statement.
is the world we live in.
It's the world we live in. Everything's online, everything's digital. Thank you so much, Amira David, for breaking it down.
Thank you.
That's our show, you guys. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. I keep it audacious, speaking the facts. We break the paradigm with truth and tact. The people don't need to be fed propaganda, spoon-fed fabrications and slander. What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it